Hello, this is Dr. Kingston, and in this video we'll be talking about the maxillary artery. We'll start off by defining the three divisions of the artery. We'll talk about the major branches that come from each, and which will supply the muscles of mastication, the meninges, and the temporomandibular joint. And then we will discuss the major branches of the maxillary artery that are associated specifically with the Pterygopalatine fossa and talk about what areas they supply. All right, the maxillary artery is one of the terminal branches of the external carotid artery, and it supplies most of the midface region. It has a whopping 18 branches, so in order to make that a little bit more digestible, we're going to split it up into three regions. Most proximally, there's the mandibular part, and I've highlighted that here in green for you. And that sits very conveniently just deep to the mandible, or the mandibular ramus specifically. The middle is the pterygoid part, and this gets its name because it sits on top of or in the lateral pterygoid muscle. The distal end sits anterior to the lateral pterygoid, and most of its branches are going to head into the pterygomaxillary fissure and to the Pterygopalatine fossa. So this gets its name from that. It's the Pterygopalatine part. If we lay some color out over the maxillary artery in its branches, we can get a better idea of where these parts sit on an actual donor. So here, deep to the mandible, here's our mandible. Here it's been cut. And here we have the mandibular part sitting just deep to that. Here is our lateral pterygoid muscle. And we have the lateral pterygoid part shown in orange sitting over the top of this. And finally, up here, anterior to this, we have the third or the Pterygopalatine part. And we can see that that is pretty small. Can't see too much of it from this view. All right, so let's look at our branches coming off here. Branching from the first part, we have the deep auricular, which enters into the external auditory meatus and will supply the anterior surface of the tympanic membrane and the TMJ. We have the anterior tympanic, which travels through the petrotympanic fissure along with the chorda tympani, and that will supply the middle ear and the posterior tympanic membrane. We have the middle meningeal artery, which travels superiorly through foramen spinosum and will supply the cranial meninges. And we also occasionally find an accessory meningeal artery, which will also supply those same meninges. It's variably present, and in this donor, it was not present. And finally, we have the inferior alveolar artery, and that will travel with the inferior alveolar nerve into the mandibular foramen, and it will supply the mandibular teeth. The second, or the pterygoid part, is where all the branches to the muscles of mastication originate. There are two sets, anterior and posterior, of deep temporal arteries, some pterygoid branches, and a masseteric artery. Also branching here is the buccal artery, which travels with the buccal nerve on the cheek. Now, if you remember the branching pattern of the mandibular nerve, you note that this is very similar to its anterior division. That anterior division of the mandibular nerve gave off mostly motor branches to the muscles of mastication, and then just one sensory branch, which was the buccal nerve. So this is the same sort of setup. We have a bunch of muscular branches and a buccal artery. Now, the third part of the maxillary artery is really not easy to see here, so I am going to switch to a diagram to talk about these branches. Here we go. And we're going to zoom in decently far, too. So we are looking at the midface anteriorly as these branches go into the Pterygopalatine fossa. All right, so here we find this portion, the third portion of our maxillary artery, giving off the descending palatine artery, the posterior superior alveolar, the artery of the pterygoid canal, sphenopalatine artery, and the infraorbital artery. And then the infraorbital infraorbital artery will give off the anterior superior alveolar artery, which will anastomose with the posterior superior alveolar. So here's posterior superior alveolar. That's so many words. And then here's the anterior, and they anastomose in the body of the maxilla, and those branches coming off that anastomosis then will go to the maxillary teeth. All right, so now let's take a look at where these branches are headed, because we really only see their origins here. So the descending palatine artery is by now an old friend of ours. It descends through the greater palatine canal, and then it splits into the greater palatine and lesser palatine arteries. And those will pass through foramina of the same name. Remember, greater will go to the hard palate and lesser will go to the soft palate. The artery of the pterygoid canal, which you can just barely make out here, makes its way back to the middle ear and ends up supplying the tympanic cavity and part of the pharyngotympanic or the eustachian tube, and a little bit of the superior pharynx. So for being a little artery, it goes a long way. We have also already seen the terminal branches of the sphenopalatine artery in the nasal cavity. So it enters into the nasal cavity through the sphenopalatine foramen, and it gives off posterior lateral nasal branches to that lateral wall. And then the bulk of the sphenopalatine artery continues on as the posterior septal branch that will eventually dive through the incisive foramen to supply the anterior palate. The other thing that the sphenopalatine artery contributes to is that Kieselbach's plexus, which, remember, is an anastomosis on the septal wall, helps to warm and moisturize air that you're inhaling. And here it's anastomosing with ethmoidal branches of the ophthalmic artery and some branches from the superior labial or facial artery. It has some further anastomoses with the greater palatine artery on the anterior palate as well. And lastly, the infraorbital artery is going to exit the pterygopalatine fossa through the inferior orbital fissure, and that will bring it onto the floor of the orbit, so we can see it as it's passing through here. It will then dive through the maxilla and reemerge on the midface here through the infraorbital foramen. And from there, it'll supply the tissues of the cheek, the upper lip, and the lower eyelid. It has some anastomoses here with the ophthalmic artery up in the orbit and the facial artery here on the midface. And that will bring us to the end of the material. Here is your review question. A blockage of the infraorbital artery at the infraorbital foramen may be compensated for by an anastomosis with which other artery? The correct answer here is facial artery. Hopefully it didn't take too long for you to dredge that up from the previous slide. All right, that is going to bring us to the end. Thank you for joining me.